There is a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a person's shoulders after a long flight with a sleeping child. It isn't simply physical exhaustion, though there's plenty of that. The stiffness from holding a small body still for hours, the dull ache that travels from the neck down through the back. It's something else too. A tenderness, a vigilance that doesn't turn off even when everything around you suggests it could. It was that particular tiredness that Daniel Ashford carried with him through the revolving doors of the Kinsworth Grand Hotel on a Thursday evening in early November, his daughter Lily asleep against his shoulder, a small bouquet of red roses held carefully in his free hand, the stems gripped low so the blooms wouldn't brush against her sleeping face. He'd bought the roses at the airport in the last few minutes before his flight, because tomorrow was the anniversary of his wife's passing, and he'd decided, somewhere over Ohio, that he wasn't going to let the day arrive without flowers in the house. Some traditions survive grief by sheer stubbornness. This was one of his. He walked toward the front desk slowly, careful with each step. The way a parent learns to walk when waking a child is the only thing in the world they're trying to avoid. Daniel Ashford was 41 years old. He had dark, slightly unruly hair that no amount of professional grooming ever fully tamed, and a beard that suggested several days of travel rather than careful cultivation. He wore a brown leather jacket, worn soft at the elbows, the kind of jacket broken in over years rather than purchased to look that way. Slung across his body was a leather messenger bag, heavy with the particular chaos that accompanies traveling with a small child: snacks, a tablet, a spare change of clothes, a stuffed rabbit with one ear more loved than the other. Lily, 6 years old, slept against his shoulder with the complete, unguarded trust that children carry before the world has taught them to be careful. Her yellow jacket was rumpled from the flight. Her dark hair, braided that morning into 2 braids, had come half undone on one side. She held the stuffed rabbit loosely in one arm, her small hand resting against the leather of her father's jacket. To anyone watching from across the lobby, they would have looked like exactly what they were: a tired father traveling alone with his daughter, arriving somewhere late, and hoping for nothing more complicated than a bed. What the lobby didn't know, what Daniel had no particular reason to announce, because announcing it had never been the point, was that he owned the building they were standing in. The Kinsworth Grand was the 7th property in a small, carefully built hospitality group Daniel had started 12 years earlier, before Lily was born, before his wife Anna had gotten sick, before the world had rearranged itself into the shape it now held. He didn't run the day-to-day operations of any single property. He had people for that: regional managers, hotel directors, a small executive team that handled what needed handling. But he made it a quiet, unannounced practice to visit his own properties from time to time, unrecognized, dressed exactly as he was dressed now. Not as a test, not as a trap, but because he'd learned, over the years, that the only way to understand how a place actually treated people was to be treated as an ordinary person yourself. He approached the front desk. 2 women stood behind it. The first was tall, blonde, her hair pulled into a neat low bun, wearing a navy blazer with a brass name tag that read Vanessa. Her arms were crossed loosely, and her eyes moved over Daniel with a quick, assessing glance that took in the leather jacket, the sleeping child, the bouquet of roses, and arrived at a conclusion before he'd said a single word. Beside her stood a second woman in a cream blazer, dark hair loose around her shoulders, arms also crossed, watching with an expression that mirrored her colleagues. Not hostile exactly, but guarded in a way that suggested she'd already decided what kind of evening this was going to be. "Good evening," Daniel said quietly, careful not to raise his voice and wake Lily. "I have a reservation. Ashford. Just checking in for the night." Vanessa's eyes moved to the computer screen in front of her, then back to Daniel. "I'm not seeing a reservation under that name," she said. "It should be there," Daniel said. "It may have been booked through corporate. Could you check again?" There was a pause, the particular pause of someone deciding how much effort a request deserves before they've even finished hearing it. "Sir," Vanessa said, "even if there were a reservation issue, we're fully booked this evening. There's a corporate event upstairs. I'm afraid we don't have anything available." Daniel shifted Lily slightly, careful not to wake her. "I understand you're busy," he said, "but I'd really appreciate it if you could look a little more carefully. It's been a long flight, and my daughter needs to sleep somewhere that isn't an airport chair. It was the kind of moment that reveals something true about a person, not because the words spoken are dramatic, but because of the small choices made in an unguarded instant. The tone selected, the level of effort offered, the willingness or unwillingness to simply look again. Vanessa glanced at her colleague. Something passed between them, unspoken but understood, the way unkindness sometimes moves between people without ever needing language. "I really am sorry," Vanessa said, in a tone that didn't sound sorry at all. "But there's simply nothing we can do. You might try the Hyatt 2 blocks over." The second woman, whose name tag read Priya, added, not unkindly in tone, but carelessly in effect, "Sometimes this time of year, walk-ins just don't work out. I'd recommend calling ahead next time." Daniel stood there a moment. He wasn't angry, not yet, and not in the way the moment might have suggested he should be. He'd built his career, in part, on a simple principle he'd learned long before he owned a single building. That you could often learn more about a person's character by watching how they treated someone who appeared to need nothing from them than by watching how they treated someone who clearly held power. He was, at this moment, a tired man in a worn jacket holding his sleeping daughter and a bouquet of roses, and to Vanessa and Priya, that was apparently all he was. He shifted Lily's weight again. She stirred slightly, murmured something into his shoulder, and settled back into sleep. "Is there a manager I could speak with?" he asked quietly. "The manager is currently occupied with the event upstairs," Vanessa said. "I really can't interrupt him for a room availability question. As I said, we're full." It was at this point, while Daniel stood quietly considering his next step, that a third person appeared from a side door near the concierge desk. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and silver-streaked dark hair pulled back simply, wearing the burgundy vest of the hotel's housekeeping supervisors. Her name tag read Marisol. She'd been walking past with an armful of fresh linens when she noticed the scene at the front desk. The sleeping child, the roses, the tired set of the father's shoulders, and the particular stiffness in the body language of the two women behind the counter. She set the linens down on a nearby luggage cart and approached. "Excuse me," she said gently, to Daniel, not to her colleagues. "Is everything all right?" Daniel looked at her. There was something in her face, an open, unhurried attentiveness entirely absent from the desk in front of him. "I have a reservation that doesn't seem to be coming up," he said, "and I'm told the hotel is full." Marisol glanced at the front desk computer, then at Vanessa. "Did you check the corporate block?" she asked. "Sometimes reservations made through the executive office don't show in the standard search. You have to look under the secondary tab." Vanessa's expression flickered irritation, quickly suppressed. "I checked the system. There's nothing." "Did you check the secondary tab?" Marisol said again, more firmly this time, the gentleness in her voice not disappearing but acquiring a clear edge underneath it. There was a pause. Vanessa clicked through the screen with visible reluctance. A moment passed. Her face changed. "There's a reservation here," she said slowly. "Ashford, under the executive booking category." "I thought there might be," Marisol said simply. But Marisol wasn't finished. She turned fully to look at Daniel. Really look at him. The way she'd clearly been trained, or had simply decided on her own, to look at every person who walked through the doors of wherever she worked. She saw the roses. "Those are beautiful," she said softly. "Is tomorrow a special day?" Daniel looked down at the flowers in his hand, slightly crushed now from the long flight, but still holding their color. "It's the anniversary," he said quietly, "of my wife. She passed 3 years ago tomorrow. We always," he paused, adjusting Lily against his shoulder. "We always put flowers out. It's become our tradition." Lily picks the vase. Marisol's expression softened in a way that had nothing to do with policy or procedure. "I'm so sorry," she said. And then, looking at Lily's sleeping face pressed against her father's shoulder, the small hand curled around the worn stuffed rabbit. "She's beautiful. She looks exhausted, poor thing." "It's been a long day for both of us," Daniel admitted. Marisol looked at the bouquet again, then reached out gently, asking permission with her eyes before her hands moved and adjusted one of the rose stems that had bent awkwardly during the flight. The way a person fixes something small simply because they notice it needs fixing, and they're the kind of person who fixes small things without being asked. "Let me find you a vase before you go up," she said. "You shouldn't have to carry these bent like that all the way to your room." It was a small gesture. It wouldn't have made the news. It wouldn't have been remarkable in almost any other context. But Daniel Ashford, who had spent 12 years building a company around a simple principle, that hospitality is not a department, it's a character trait, and you cannot train it into someone who doesn't already carry the instinct, felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt since walking through the revolving doors. Someone had finally seen him. Not the reservation. Not the inconvenience of a late check-in. Him, tired, grieving, traveling alone with his daughter, holding roses for a wife who was no longer there to receive them. "Thank you," he said. "That's very kind." "It's nothing," Marisol said, already turning to retrieve a vase from behind the concierge desk. "It's the least this place can do after keeping you standing here so long." She said the last part loudly enough that Vanessa and Priya both heard it clearly. What happened next unfolded the way these things sometimes do, not through anger, but through simple, unavoidable clarity. Daniel checked in. The reservation, once properly located, was confirmed, a suite on the 9th floor, booked weeks earlier through his own corporate office, the kind of routine booking that should never have required this much difficulty to locate. But before he went upstairs, he asked, quietly, to see the hotel's general manager. Not in anger, but because he believed, as he always had, that patterns of behavior were worth understanding before they were corrected. The general manager, a composed man named Nathaniel Cross, arrived within minutes, apologetic and visibly anxious the moment he recognized the name on the registration screen. He'd worked for Daniel's company for 6 years, had met Daniel exactly twice at regional meetings, and clearly hadn't expected to encounter his employer standing tired and travel-worn in his own lobby with a sleeping child and a bouquet of roses. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I had no idea you were. I'm terribly sorry for the confusion at the desk. I'll address it immediately." Daniel held up a hand gently. "I'd like to talk to you about what just happened. Not as an executive correcting his staff, just as a guest who was treated unkindly tonight for no reason other than the way I happened to look when I walked in." He told Nathaniel, plainly and without exaggeration, what had occurred. The dismissiveness, the unwillingness to check twice, the suggestion to simply go elsewhere rather than do the small additional work of looking properly. And then he told him about Marisol and the vase and the kindness that had cost her nothing but had meant, in that tired moment, almost everything. "I'm not asking you to fire anyone in anger," Daniel said. "I'm asking you to think about what kind of hotel we're actually running. If the woman who restocks linens understands hospitality better than the people standing at the front desk." Nathaniel Cross did, in the end, let Vanessa and Priya go, not as an act of cruelty, and not that same night, but after a careful review the following week that confirmed what Daniel had already suspected, that this hadn't been an isolated lapse, but a pattern documented in more than one prior guest complaint, quietly absorbed and forgotten. The way small unkindnesses sometimes are when no one with sufficient standing happens to notice them. It wasn't really about the termination, in the end. Daniel took no satisfaction in it. He'd built his company on the belief that people generally rise to the standard they're shown, and he felt, in some private way, that the failure belonged at least partly to the systems that had allowed 2 employees to treat a tired father so carelessly, without consequence, for as long as they apparently had. What mattered more to him? What he thought about, in fact, far more often in the weeks that followed, was Marisol. He found her 2 days later, before he checked out, in the small break room behind the housekeeping office, eating a sandwich during her short lunch window. "Marisol," he said, knocking gently on the open door. "Do you have a minute?" She looked up, surprised to see him, and immediately began to stand, smoothing her vest. "Mr. Ashford, I didn't realize." "Please," he said. "Sit. I just wanted to thank you properly for the other night." She sat back down, looking faintly embarrassed, the way kind people often do when their kindness is noticed and named directly. "It was nothing," she said. "I just don't like seeing people treated like that. Especially not a father traveling alone with a little one. I raised 3 kids on my own after my husband passed. I know what that kind of tired looks like." Daniel nodded slowly. "I didn't know that," he said. "Not many people ask," Marisol said simply, without bitterness, just as a fact about how these things tend to go. He sat down across from her. "I'd like to ask you something," he said. "I'm restructuring our regional training program, the one that teaches new hires what hospitality actually means, beyond the script. I think you'd be very good at helping design it. Actually, I think you'd be better at it than most of the people currently doing the job. Marisol blinked. I clean rooms, Mr. Ashford. I'm not a trainer. You saw a tired man and a sleeping child and a bent flower stem, Daniel said. And you fixed all three things without being asked, in about 90 seconds, while two trained desk staff stood 3 feet away and saw nothing at all. That's not a small skill. That's the entire skill. I'd like to pay you properly to teach it to other people. Marisol accepted after several days of careful consideration and one long phone call with her oldest daughter, who told her in no uncertain terms that she'd be a fool to turn down what was being offered. Within the year, she became the regional training coordinator for guest experience across all 7 of Daniel's properties, a role that hadn't existed before that November evening, built specifically around what she'd already been doing quietly, without title or recognition, for years. She kept, on her office wall, a small framed photograph, not of the hotel, not of any award, but of a simple glass vase holding a bouquet of slightly crushed red roses, which Daniel had sent to her along with a card the week after Lily's mother's anniversary had passed. The card read simply, "Thank you for seeing us when it would have been so easy not to." Lily, for her part, remembered very little of that particular evening. She'd been asleep for most of it, after all, and children carry their memories selectively, holding on to warmth and releasing detail. But she remembered, in the vague way young children remember important things without understanding why they're important, a kind woman with silver-streaked hair who had fixed a flower for her daddy, and who had smiled at her briefly while she pretended to still be asleep against her father's shoulder. Years later, when Lily was older and beginning to understand more fully the kind of man her father was, the quiet, unannounced way he moved through the world, checking on the things that mattered rather than simply trusting the reports that crossed his desk, she asked him once why that particular evening had stayed with him so clearly out of so many nights of travel. Daniel told her, simply, that it was the night he'd learned all over again something he'd always believed but had needed to be reminded of. That kindness rarely announces itself with fanfare. It comes quietly, in someone noticing a bent flower stem, or a tired set of shoulders, or a sleeping child who deserves a bed rather than a lobby chair. And that the people who offer it without title, without expectation of reward, are very often the ones who deserve, more than anyone else in the room, to be truly seen. And perhaps that's what stays with us longest from an evening like this one. Not the unkindness, which fades quickly enough, but the quiet decency of someone who simply chose to look a little closer. We don't always know, walking through a door tired and travel-worn, who will see us clearly and who won't. But it's worth remembering that the kindness we receive in our hardest, most ordinary moments, offered freely by someone expecting nothing in return, is very often the thing we carry longest, long after the rest of the evening has been forgotten.